You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. Welcome to the season finale of Season 5 of Storytime in Paris. This has been a fabulous season, and I'm really excited for what's to come. This week, I had the pleasure of sitting down with lawyer, law professor, and New York Times bestselling author Pam Jenoff to talk about her book, Name Sapphire. Name Sapphire begins in 1942 Europe and centers around 3 young women: Hannah, who flees Nazi Germany and is desperate to escape occupied Europe; Lily, her long-lost cousin who provides safe harbor, but has her own family to protect; and Micheline, the head of a secret resistance network in Belgium. It's a riveting, fast-paced story about courage, sacrifice, family, love, and impossible choices. Please allow me to introduce Pam Jenoff, author of Name Sapphire. Hello, Pam. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to talk to you about Name Sapphire, but before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name's Pam Jenoff, and I am an author. Name Sapphire is my 12th book, and my books are primarily centered around World War II and the Holocaust. So Name Sapphire is my latest book. It's been out for, 3 weeks now, and when I'm not writing, I live in New Jersey outside Philadelphia, where I also teach law school, and I have 3 children, and we have 6 pets. So that's life here.
6 pets?
Yes.
What are your pets?
Oh my goodness. We have a dog, 2 cats, a bird, a lizard, and a rabbit. Don't even get me started.
Are they all free range? Do they run around and play with each other?
Well, they're all free range, but they sort of have different zones of the house. So there's this new kitten wreaking havoc, and the dog is scared of the cat, but the new kitten will go attack the rabbit. So it's kind of a free range, but refereed. It has to be carefully refereed.
All right. I don't mean to derail us, but I can't avoid a question about animals. So what is your connection to Paris or to France?
So my connection comes through time I spent in Europe more generally. So first I was a graduate student at Cambridge. So I lived in England for 2 years. And at that time, I did all that sort of Euro-railing thing that we all did when we were young with the backpacks and the trains. So I was certainly through Paris at that time. And then later, I returned to Europe as a diplomat for the U.S. State Department. So I was stationed in Poland, in Krakow, for more than 2 years. And I had time to travel then as well. And of course, I came to Paris then and any number of times. And so my real connection is that I write books set during World War II. And of course, so much happened in France and in Paris during that time that inevitably the stories that I illuminate and the history that I discover keeps bringing me back to Paris.
Yeah. And ironically, perhaps, Name Sapphire does not take place in France or in Paris. Can you tell us a little bit about what Name Sapphire is about?
I can, and not principally in Paris, but it does touch upon it, as we'll see.
Yes.
So in order to explain Name Sapphire, I sort of have to share how I find ideas. And that is because although I lived in Poland for several years among the survivors, and they shared their stories with me, I don't write their stories. I don't feel that those are mine to tell. And so instead, what I do when I start a book is I go looking for a piece of history that I want to center a fictitious story around. And when I'm looking for that piece of history, I'm looking for what I call the gasp and the questions. And so the gasp is that if I can find a piece of history that's so fresh and untold that after a quarter century or more of working with the war, it still makes me gasp, then I'm hopeful that I'm onto something that readers will feel the same way about. And so in the case of Codename Sapphire, the gasp was learning about a train, a Nazi prisoner train that was headed from Belgium to Auschwitz, and about a group of brave young people who endeavored to stop that train in its tracks and break into the train and free the prisoners inside. And so when I heard this story, I gasped. And then, of course, I had questions. And my questions were, how had these young people been so brave to attempt this feat? And at the same time, why hadn't more people tried to do things like this? And so out of that inspiration, Codename Sapphire was born. And if it's okay, I'll tell you a little bit about it, about the book.
Please.
So in Codename Sapphire, we meet Hannah Martel, and she's a young German Jewish political activist. And through violence related to, the Nazi regime, she has lost not just her fiance, but her unborn child. And Hannah is a wanted woman. She has to get out of Europe. And so she boards a ship bound for North America. But her ship is turned away both from the United States and Cuba. And Hannah is forced to return to Europe. She finds shelter with her cousin Lily in Brussels. Now, Lily, who Hannah hasn't seen since childhood, is altogether different because Lily is affluent. Her husband is a doctor. She has a young son. And Lily is trying to pretend like the war isn't happening to her. But Hannah still needs to get out of Europe. And so Hannah connects with something called the Sapphire Line. And Sapphire is a resistance organization which is engaged in the important work of helping downed Allied airmen flee occupied Europe. Sapphire is headed by a young woman named Micheline, and Micheline and Hannah strike up a deal. So Micheline says, you help with the work of the Sapphire Line, and I will help you leave Europe for good. But Hannah gets in too deep with the work for the Sapphire Line, and through a series of mishaps and mistaken identity, her work results in the arrest of Lily, Lily's husband, and their young son. And so when Lily and her family are slated for deportation and put on the train to Auschwitz, it is Hannah who endeavors to free them from the train.
That's an excellent recap. And there's so much in there. There's so much that I want to talk to you about. But even before that, I was reading about you and your personal history, not in a creepy way. I was looking at your website and reading about you, and your life seems really fascinating. And I also noticed, as you mentioned, that most of your books are set in this World War II time period. So I'm curious, sort of like a chicken and the egg situation, did your personal career path lead to the fascination with this time period, or was it the other way around and you were already interested in World War II and that defined your career path?
Well, it's a weird combination, right? It never comes together quite so neatly. But, I was always a child who wanted to be a novelist. I loved World War II and historical fiction growing up. I read all those, remember those big, thick historical fiction books like by Herman Wouk and Leon Uris and James Michener? They were all men at the time, but those books. And so I had the interest, but I certainly did not set out on this path. When I joined the diplomatic service, the Foreign Service, I was sent to Poland as a first tour diplomat, and I was expected to stamp visas and passports and help Americans when they got in trouble abroad, to do consular work. But I arrived in Poland at this very unique moment in time in the mid-1990s when Poland and its neighbors had just come out of a half century of communism. And all during that era, they had no free speech, they were cut off from the West, and they never resolved their issues related to World War II and the Holocaust. And so in the 1990s, they're suddenly going, well, what about property restitution and anti-Semitism and preserving the camps? And all of these issues were very important. And so I sort of stumble into Poland, and I'm this young woman in my early 20s who had gone halfway around the world by myself. And I had remember, there's no cell phones at this point, and there's no internet. So I was completely isolated in Eastern Europe, and I'm Jewish. And so I went looking for the synagogue, and I went to their synagogue at the surviving Jewish community in Krakow. I was there every Friday night. I was at the rabbi's house every Saturday for lunch. And this elderly community, they became like grandparents to me. And it was a very special relationship. And the US government saw that I had a connection with the people. And they were like, you go work on all that stuff from the war. So it was sort of this like ad hoc kind of moment when it came together that for more than 2 years, that was my full-time job, was working on Holocaust issues and the war for the US government. And so it was an experience that was difficult and rewarding personally and professionally, and really transformed me. And so I regard my books kind of as love songs to the people and the era.
I can really see that. I can really see that in your writing. That's beautiful. How long after that experience did you write your first novel? Or not, did you write it? Was it published, I suppose, is a more reasonable question.
Oh, goodness. So, I was one of those little kids who always wanted to be a writer. Like my 5th grade yearbook said the next Judy Blume, which was hilarious when I met Judy. And it was like, look, I'm the next Judy Blume. So, but, I all through the years when I went to school and I lived abroad, I actually had a lot of time to write, and I never got started. Everybody's got one project in their closet that they would like to get off the ground and cannot. So for me, it was like the novel. I'm trying to do this. So the turning point for me was actually 9/11. So I did not continue on in diplomatic service after Poland. I wanted to come back to the United States. So I came back. I went to law school. And I graduated from law school and I began practicing law in Philadelphia on September 4th, 2001.
Oh.
It was a Tuesday. And 1 week later, 9/11 happened. And I had this life moment where, I still love the law. I mean, I'm talking to you from my office at Rutgers where I teach law school. I love the law. But 9/11 made me realize that I had a deeper dream of becoming a novelist. And if I had been a 9/11 victim, I never would have realized that dream. So it was kind of this mortality moment, and I knew I had to get started on writing. So I took a course in Philadelphia at a night school that was actually called Write Your Novel This Year. And I started working on my first book, which would then become The Commandant's Girl. But it was not a hop, skip, and a jump from that epiphany to the shelves. It was 5 years still, 39 publisher rejections until, so finally somebody made an offer for my first book and away we went. So it was a really long time. And of course, it also was not that easy because even though I had this epiphany and I wanted to write, I was still an attorney at a big firm with a lot of student loan debt. And so I still had to work, and I wrote those books every morning from 5 to 7 before I went to the firm.
Wow.
So I had the epiphany in 2001 and my first book was on the shelves in 2007.
That's still very impressive, though. This whole story is fascinating to me.
And lest you think it was an overnight success, I want to add that it was still another 10 years till it hit the bestseller list. It wasn't like an overnight sensation. My first book came out on March 1st, 2007. And my first book to hit the New York Times was March 1st, 2017. Exactly 10 years day to day.
Wow. Yeah, I guess that's important to keep in mind.
You remember the dates. Like I know the day I got the call about my first publication was Friday, April 8th, 2005. Like, the dates,
There's another recurring theme that I've noticed in your books, which is this theme of women working together, these female friendships and the trust between them during these harrowing times, during wartime, and often in the context of spy networks and resistance fighters. What draws you to these relationships at this period of time?
So what I love about writing women in history, aside from that we are finally giving them their due where they've been ignored so long, is that you take a woman who through normal history would have lived with her feet on a very set path, but through war and other catastrophe, she's thrown off that path and she's tested and she's challenged. So first, I love to see what she'll do. But secondly, she crosses paths with people who through normal life she never would have met, other women sometimes who are very different from herself. And so I love to see these women transcending their differences and coming together to help one another because especially in our world today, we are so fractured and there is so much otherness and division that my hope is if readers see these women transcending their differences, that they will empathize and it will help to reduce some of the otherness and division we all feel today.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. I really enjoy the relationship between Hannah and Lily. And what's interesting is that they're cousins who used to be really close, but their lives have taken them in different directions. And when they reconnect, they're almost careful with each other because they remember how they used to be and they want to connect now, but they both have inadmissions that they keep from one another. And it's so different from if they were best friends or if they were sisters, or maybe they could take each other for granted in a different way. Can you talk about where your idea to craft their relationship in this way came from?
It's interesting. I don't know if in talking to so many writers, you've heard about plotters and pantsers. Do people talk about this with you? So we writers say there's two types of writers, plotters and pantsers. So plotters are these dear souls who outline and write chronologically and make things look nice before they move on. And I'm not one of those generally. I'm a pantser. Pantsers open a computer and go, blah, and words come out in a random order for a really long time. So often when people ask me, did you know this at the beginning or did you know this at the end? It's actually super hard for me to identify what is a beginning and what is an end, right? I'm just never quite sure. However, I know when I started this project, I was very taken with the notion of these two women who had known each other as children, right? And had grown apart and were seeing each other again. And I didn't know if they were friends, were they sisters? They turned out to be cousins. But I wanted these two very different women who had once shared a past, but had gone different ways. So the two of them I knew pretty early on, although, the interplay and the finer points, that really comes up through the writing. That's not something I predetermine. And then, of course, there's a third woman in this book who's Micheline, and she's the head of this Sapphire network, and she's kind of outside, right? She's really a different person. And so I've written books with one point of view, 2 and 3. And 3 is very interesting. It's almost like braiding, although you're not going A, B, C, A, B, C, sometimes it becomes more like A, B, B, C, B, C, A, depending whose story needs to be told at a given moment.
That's very interesting. And it leads me to another question that I had for you, which is this book is a very fast-paced book. At least for me, it was very fast-paced. I found myself compulsively reading and turning the pages and wanting to know what happens. And without giving anything away, I will say that I found it very satisfyingly unpredictable.
Oh, good.
When you write, are you writing at this particularly fast pace?
It's funny. I am perceived as a fast writer, and I think this is a myth. I'm going to be really honest. So I used to write book a year, but I'm so much older and I so much prefer slowing down right now. But I'm perceived as someone who writes fast. A good author friend of mine, Jenna Blum, she calls me the general because, she thinks I'm so, but that's actually a total myth because the truth is I have no stamina. So I am a short burst writer. And if you gave me 8 hours, I wouldn't know what to do with 8 hours. But I like working in these little chunks of time. So the deal I made with myself when I realized I have no stamina is if I can't write long, I must write often. So I will attempt, circumstances permitting, to write 7 days a week, but often that's just a very short amount of time. So I can't say that I write particularly fast.
But it sounds like you're sprinting. It sounds like it's fast in these little bursts.
I just feel glacial these days, especially I just came off book tour. And if you're exhausted or if there's other things going on, there are times that are more productive than others. But I actually think the secret for me to productivity is I don't think of writing as one task. I think of it as 3 or 4 or 5 distinct tasks, whether you're throwing down the words pantser style, whether you're revising and making stuff look nice, whether you're outlining and problem solving in a notebook, or whether you are doing research. Those are different tasks that I can do at different times of the day. And so the goal to me is just to move the ball forward in some way every single day.
Okay, that makes sense. I really enjoyed reading. I feel like enjoyed is such a hard word to use when you're talking about Nazis and German occupation.
Yes.
But I guess I should say I really appreciated that this book, most of these books set in this time period do come, as you say, from England or from France. And I really appreciated that this one was set in Belgium, which is an area that I don't know as much about during World War II. Can you talk about what it was like to set it in Belgium?
Sure. So, it's interesting when you think about setting for every book. So my heart is kind of Eastern Europe, a lot of it, right? So I've done a lot of Poland and I love it. I know it. And then even when I go to Paris, like I have to learn, I have to learn the nuance of French culture. And I have to learn what's interesting as a historical fiction writer is like 1941 and 1942 look completely different. And so you have to really delve into that. But it was so fun to find a story that was in a different country like Belgium, where I had never spent any time. And there were so many interesting things I learned from Belgium. First of all, the Germans didn't sort of barrel into Belgium the way they did Poland. They went in under this pretense of like the good occupiers, like almost they had this sort of pretense that they were going to let people be a little bit, which of course was utterly untrue, but it sort of affected the initial point of view of people. Secondly, you can't get very far into Belgium without learning about the escape lines. Like my book, it's called Sapphire, but in real life they were called things like the Comet Line and Dutch Paris, and these lines that got the downed Allied airmen and other people out of occupied Europe. And that was very interesting. And then there was so much heroism of local people in Belgium because these lines took a lot of work, not just the couriers, but you needed like safe houses and food and documents, and people were risking their lives. And these weren't like young partisans that could up and leave when things went south. These were people with homes and businesses who were kind of sitting ducks when it all went badly. And so the heroism was really remarkable.
Were you able to go to Belgium and see these places and go to Breendonk? And
not yet. Pandemic clipped wings. So even for the book before this, The Woman with the Blue Star, I actually had a trip to Poland booked for research, and the trip was booked for March 11th, 2020. So, everybody, things just have not been happening normally the past few years. But I think when you're writing historical fiction, it's nice to go to see the space, and like if you turn this way, the physical layout is really nice to see. But thank goodness so much is online right now, whether that is the archives of all the various museums that are now virtual, the maps, the periodicals, the memoirs, the correspondence, the photographs. And I'm a big library person, so I love dusty archives. I love finding that one out of print book that I need, So there's a lot of resources.
I love that. I also loved that you made Hannah an artist and a political cartoonist. Can you talk about why you made that decision and the research that you did behind that?
Well, it's interesting because you want to think about the different roles that people could do in a resistance. And one thing I've learned over these books is it's boundless. Like, people will want to say to me, well, like I wrote Lost Girls of Paris, and they'll say, well, they were spies. I'm like, no, they weren't spies. They were engaged in sabotage and subversion. And that's completely different than espionage, right? So there's like these nuances. And so there were many people working on these underground newspapers, and having someone who at a moment in time was able to put her artistic talent to the service of the resistance, and then things went horribly wrong for her. And then she really couldn't bear to do that again. Use her art to express herself in that way was just an interesting study in the person.
Yeah, for sure. It was very interesting to read about. There's a quote in the book that really struck me. And it's that war forces hard choices about who we save. And this is a thing that I know intellectually. It's not the first time that I've heard this statement, but reading it in context, when I did, it made me stop short. And I think in this book, there's a real exploration of personal needs versus familial responsibilities versus what's right and wrong on a larger scale. And I think it's an exploration that oftentimes there isn't time for in a book about World War II. And like I said, this book is very fast paced. And yet I feel like this exploration is an undercurrent that is woven throughout the whole book. Can you talk about whether this was a specific focus of yours and also what it was like to write about?
Sure. So, I feel like throughout my books, this is kind of a thread and a really important theme for me. And it really goes back to my days in Poland. So I went to Europe with a very black and white traditional view of history, right? And I was in Poland and I had a very safe and peaceful life there, but there were things that could hurl you back to the war. So you see a crowd gather, you hear an old siren, and right away you're like fight or flight, and would make me want to go run and hide in a basement. And so that moment made me wonder if I had been an ordinary person in Europe, not necessarily Jewish, but I had just been there during the war, what would I have done? Like, I certainly would not have helped the Germans, but I am not a brave human. I actually, when I saw The Wizard of Oz when I was little, I thought Dorothy should have stayed in Oz instead of fighting her way back. Like, it's a nice place. It's less dangerous. And I'm being a little flip, but I'm serious. Like, I'm not that brave. So I don't know, especially now that I have children, would I have not just kind of hidden or would I have been brave? And so what I took away from those years was that history is not made up of those battles and those governments we read about, but history is actually an infinite number of individual decisions that people make. And that's what I want a reader to do, is sort of stand in the shoes of my protagonist and wonder, what would I have done? And we face those choices today, especially for women, especially as mothers. These are choices we all face on some level.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that it's that makes the book unpredictable, but not in a like surprise, 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 surprise kind of way. Like, it's unpredictable in a way that also makes a lot of logical sense. And also I think it kind of grounds the story. It is these just moment by moment decisions where a lot of it especially is survival and also like protection of your family.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
So my last question is, so I've lived in France now for almost 13 years, and I've come to learn a lot about occupied France. And I don't know that much about the occupation in other countries. In France, I can tell you that the occupation led to a lot of distrust and paranoia. It sounds like you experienced the same sort of repercussions in Poland. There's this like fear of being spied on, the people that you trust turning on you, and I can still see traces of that paranoia today. Do you have any insight into how that time, that occupation stayed with the Belgian people, maybe in contrast to the other two cultures?
I haven't spent enough time in Belgium to comment authoritatively on that question. But what I think we see with the war, regardless of country, so there's sort of we feel like there's these nationalized responses, but I always hate they. Like, they is a wonderful modern pronoun, but it's a terrible word in history, because whenever anyone challenges me that a group of people did or did not, I'm like, well, which people, which they are we talking? Because I want to think about the individuals, and so for me, what it really the war comes down to is there's this very much this shared history. Right? The war is a shared history by various groups of people, Jewish people, and within the Jewish people, they're not a monolith. So there's different people, non-Jews in the countries who had their own particular suffering or experience. And it's how can we talk about the war in a way that respects and values each of those experiences, regardless of country?
Yeah, for sure. I was just thinking more along the lines, in France, people are so worried about, the government is so worried about that having happened again, that they don't do census anymore. Like, they don't have any records of who is what ethnicity or what religion, because they don't want to have a record of it, so that should anything like that happen again, there is no ledger of all of the Jewish people, for example.
That's a fascinating point. I have not looked into that in Belgium, but that's really interesting. I need to look into that. That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it causes its own problems, right? Because there's no clear-cut sense of who is actually underprivileged or not, because there's none of that information that is collected.
Yep.
But it is interesting how to see where that comes from.
Yeah, that's amazing. I may need to look into that for something else I'm working on. Thank you.
You're welcome to it.
That's awesome.
Have you always dreamed of owning a place in Paris? If you're planning on moving, renting, buying, or selling a place in France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gail Boisclair and Marie Pistinier, hosts of the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris Estate of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So I think now it would be really nice to hear a little bit from the book.
I would love to.
Can you tell us a little bit about what is happening at this point in time contextually?
Yeah, so interestingly, I'm going to read from the opening chapter of Name Sapphire, which ironically, although we've been talking about Belgium, is set in Paris. And so Micheline, who is the head of the Sapphire line, we see her on a Paris street and she spots an airman who they were transiting, and one person was supposed to drop and one person was supposed to pick up. But this airman is sort of standing there orphaned and she has to step in. So that's what I'm going to read from. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Micheline threw the still smoldering cigarette to the ground and crushed it with the high heel of her black leather boot. Then she marched across the darkened Paris street and grabbed the man she'd never seen before by the lapels, throwing him back against the stained brick wall of the station. "Kiss me," she ordered in English, whispering tersely. The airman, his crew cut a dead giveaway despite his French civilian clothing and chapeau, stood motionless, too surprised to move, as Micheline reached up and pulled him toward her, pressing her open mouth against his musty scent mixed with a hint of tobacco. The streetlight cast a yellow pool on the pavement around them, illuminating their embrace. Micheline felt the man's body responding against her own. The navy beret which covered her red curls tilted off-center, threatening to fall to the ground. A second later, Micheline broke away and brought her mouth close to his ear. "If you hope to live, follow me." 30 minutes later, they reached the safe house apartment. Micheline took the airman's hand and led him up the stairs to a room which was bare except for a mattress and a weathered armoire and a sink in the corner. He would stay no longer than 12 hours in the city, just enough time to rest and carry on. Inside, the airman looked weakened and confused. "We went down quickly after we were shot," he offered, saying too much, as they all did. "They hit the fuel tank." "Are you wounded?" "No, there were others, though. Someone will look for them, right?" She nodded, but it was a lie. The network could not spare the resources to go back and search for those who were wounded and presumed dead. He opened his mouth to ask something else, but she put her finger to her lips and shook her head. It was not safe to say too much anywhere, even here. The airman's eyes widened. She had seen more than once how very afraid the young soldiers were, the ones who panicked or cried out in their sleep. They were 18 and 19, not more than boys, and thousands of kilometers from home. Micheline herself was just a few years older, and sometimes she wondered why she could be strong when they could not. "Empty your pockets," she instructed firmly. There were too many times when a well-intentioned Brit carried something sentimental from home, which would be a dead giveaway if he was stopped and questioned. "Here," she rummaged through the armoire for new clothes. Then she threw the clothes at him and gestured toward a screen that offered a bit of privacy at the far end of the room. "Get dressed." He moved slowly, clumsily toward the divider. A tram clacked by on the street below, rattling the cloudy window panes. A few minutes later, he reemerged in the simple shoes and buttoned shirt of a peasant farmer, an outfit that would help him to get through the south of France to the Pyrenees. She took his old clothes from him. "There's bread in the cupboard," she said. "Stay away from the windows and don't make a sound. Someone will come for you before dawn. That person will have a key. Don't open the door for anyone." "Merci," he ventured, and it seemed likely that it was all the French he knew or understood. "Bonne chance," she replied, wishing him luck. Without waiting for a response, she walked briskly from the apartment. She wondered uneasily whether he would still be there safely when the new passeur arrived to claim him for the next leg of his long journey, or whether another calamity would befall the already struggling network.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. So what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
So I do. I'm really slow, as I said, these days. It takes me a long time to kind of hone in right now. So I'm pretty slow, but I am working and I love the new project. But all I can say right now is it has a story during the war. It has a story after the war. And those two stories are connected by a mysterious object. But I will also add for you that it does have a strong Paris connection.
Ooh, exciting. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with you and what's going on with this book and the next book?
So my website is www.pamjenoff.com, but I also invite readers to contact me individually through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, email, wherever they are hanging out, because once I get done promoting this book and saying Codename Sapphire every other second, all I will talk about is my Yellow Lab scoop and what I'm reading.
Fabulous. And I'll include links to everything so that people can find you really easily. Thank you so much, Pam. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you again to Pam Jenoff for being such an excellent season finale guest. You can find Pam on Instagram and Twitter at Pam Jenoff, on Facebook at Pam Jenoff Author, and on her website at pamjenoff.com. And thanks to you for listening this season. I'll be back again in May with a whole new season of excellent guests. If you want a sneak peek at who those guests are, and you want to ask your own questions of those authors, which I encourage you to do, please follow Paris Underground Radio on Facebook and Instagram, and me at Jenny Foria on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where I'm probably most active. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the fastest and easiest way to help me attract more listeners, which will attract more great authors. It's a beautiful, wonderful circle of life. Please also spread the word to people you know who also love to read. If you'd like to go even deeper, join our book club over on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio, where I invite guests who have been on the podcast to come speak with us about their books and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil on the podcast. Thank you again, and until season 6, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.